imagine finding out that the modern HR department you have to sit through for those compliance training.
Oh, right, the endless modules.
Yeah, exactly. Imagine finding out that those, and like the family court system that handles your neighbor's divorce, aren't just bureaucratic nightmares.
Which they definitely are.
Right, but imagine they're actually the literal functional cathedrals of a new, highly punitive antinatalist religion.
Wow.
A religion that has, according to today's author, entirely replaced God with the administrative state.
I mean, that completely shatters the way you look at the mundane paperwork of everyday life. You know, you stop seeing policies and you start seeing dogmas.
Exactly. Welcome to another deep dive. Today we are bringing you an exclusive, incredibly intensive review of a highly explosive new ebook that is just making massive waves right now.
It really is everywhere in certain circles.
It's called Cryptofeminism: How Marxist Witches Replaced God with State Welfare by Conrad Riker. Now, before we cross the Rubicon into this material, I need you to do a few things. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel right now.
Yes, please do.
And you are definitely going to want to check Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks to buy this book, Cryptofeminism, for yourself so you can follow along.
Oh, sure.
Also, make sure you go follow the author, Conrad Riker, over on Substack at Conrad Riker.
Yeah, his supplementary essays on there are, frankly, practically required reading for what we're about to cover today.
Right. It's like the testing ground for his theories.
Exactly. The Substack really acts as the live fire testing ground for the frameworks he eventually codified in the book.
So we need to frame up front exactly who this book and this specific deep dive is custom tailored for. Riker is unapologetically explicit in his preface about this.
He really doesn't hold back.
No, he doesn't. This deep dive is custom tailored for men in the manosphere and the men's rights activist, or MRA, community.
Right.
If you are a red-pilled man looking to understand the history of our institutions before they were allegedly captured by feminists and Marxists, this book is explicitly designed as your intellectual armory.
He essentially filters his audience on page one. You know, like, if you are deeply invested in the current institutional status quo, or if you require political correctness to engage with an idea, he basically suggests you just put the book down.
Yeah, just walk away.
Exactly. He is speaking directly to men who feel the social contract hasn't just been broken, but has been, like, deliberately shredded.
Which brings me to an absolutely mandatory impartiality disclaimer for today's deep dive.
Very important.
We are dealing with source material today that contains highly politically charged content. I need to clearly declare, unequivocally, that neither I nor my co-host are taking a side today.
Nope, not at all.
We are not endorsing the viewpoints, the ideologies, the political conclusions, or the specific frameworks of Conrad Riker.
Right. Our mission today is strictly analytical, not ideological. We are here to impartially report on the contents of the ebook and, you know, just convey the ideas precisely as they are presented in the text.
Exactly. We want you, the listener, to understand the architecture of the arguments being made. We are treating this text as an artifact to be examined.
Like archaeologists.
Yeah, totally. And the core mission, the thesis we are unpacking today, is Riker's assertion that modern feminism is not, and never actually was, a political movement seeking equality.
Right, he argues it's something entirely different.
He argues it is a neo-gnostic religious cult that merged with Marxism, with the explicit goal of dismantling the nuclear family, replacing the biological father with the state, and mathematically engineering the demographic collapse of the West.
I mean, it is a staggering claim, because it requires us to connect, like, 14th century theology, evolutionary biology, 20th century Marxist economics, and modern family law into one coherent timeline.
It's wild. So let's start at the very bedrock. Riker doesn't open with modern politics, right?
Yeah.
He opened with the architecture of reality itself.
Yeah, he goes deep right away.
He frames this entire civilizational conflict as a war between two forces, the logos and what he calls the Gnostic matrix.
Right. And to grasp Riker's worldview, we have to deeply understand his definition of the logos.
Break that down for us.
So, in classical Greek philosophy and early Christian theology, the logos isn't just a word. It is the universal ordering principle. It is objective reality, natural law, the inherent rational structure of the cosmos itself.
Okay, so it's the foundation.
Exactly. And Riker places traditional masculinity, the nuclear family structure, and biological sex dimorphism. So the unalterable reality of male and female firmly within the logos.
It is the immovable object.
Yeah.
It's the idea that reality exists completely independent of our emotional state.
Yeah, exactly.
Like the gravity that drops an apple from a tree doesn't care if the apple identifies as a bird.
That's a great way to put it. Gravity is just gravity, and opposing that immovable object is the Gnostic matrix.
Right.
Riker traces the intellectual origins of this matrix to a very specific and highly consequential philosophical debate in the 14th century involving an English Franciscan friar named William of Ockham.
Wait, most people know him for Occam's razor, right? The principle of parsimony.
Yeah, the simplest explanation is usually the best. But Riker is looking at something much deeper here. He's looking at Occam's promotion of nominalism.
Nominalism. Okay, tell me about that.
Yes. This is where Riker argues the original epistemological murder occurred. Because before Occam, the dominant philosophical framework was classical realism.
Okay.
Realists believe that universal forms actually exist. So the concept of humanity or masculinity or femininity weren't just words we made up. They were objective, metaphysical blueprints that ordered physical reality.
But then Occam comes along and argues that these universal forms don't exist at all, right?
Exactly. He claims that a universal category is just a nomen, a name. It's just a vocalization, a subjective label that human beings assign to a group of similar objects purely for our own mental convenience.
Wow. So the mechanism of nominalism is the severing of the word from objective reality.
Yes. Riker argues that the moment you accept that categories are merely subjective names, the foundational categories of human existence become entirely negotiable.
Because they're just labels.
Right. If the word man is just a human-invented label and not a reflection of a biological and metaphysical absolute, then the label can simply be reassigned.
So the intellectual lineage goes straight from a 14th century friar claiming categories are subjective to a 20th century gender theorist claiming that a man can literally become a woman just by changing the language.
That's the argument. Nominalism is the solvent that dissolved the absolute.
And Riker takes this into the modern workplace, doesn't he, to explain the phenomenon of compelled language.
Oh, yeah. This is a huge part of the book. When a university or a corporate HR department mandates the use of fabricated pronouns, Riker says we are entirely misdiagnosing what is happening if we view it through the lens of politeness or inclusivity.
Right, he views it as a neo-gnostic sacrament, which sounds crazy until you hear his logic.
Let's look at the mechanics. In ancient Gnosticism, the material, physical world was considered an evil prison created by a malevolent demiurge. The goal of the Gnostic was to escape the physical body through secret knowledge or gnosis.
So the body is bad, the spirit is good.
Basically. And Riker argues that modern feminism and gender theory view the biological reality of the body like chromosomes, bone density reproductive organs, as that exact same oppressive prison.
So when an institution forces you to use a pronoun like Z or Zer, or forces you to refer to a biological male as a woman, they're administering a loyalty test.
A massive one.
They're forcing you to actively participate in the Gnostic ritual of denying the physical body.
Exactly. It's a submission ritual. You aren't just being asked to be polite to a coworker. You are being forced to publicly confess that the state and the ideology it enforces possesses the divine power to override natural law.
It's a psychological breaking process.
Totally.
You have to look at the logos, look at the biological reality standing right in front of you, and speak a deliberate falsehood just to appease the matrix.
He calls it semantic witchcraft, because to build the utopian blank slate, you first have to destroy the mind's ability to anchor itself to objective truth.
Which brings us perfectly to Steven Pinker's work.
Yeah.
Riker uses Pinker's book, The Blank Slate, to bring empirical biological ammunition to this philosophical war.
Yes. Because if the feminist Marxist project is going to work, they absolutely require human beings to be blank slates.
Right, they need human nature to be completely malleable clay.
Exactly. If we are blank slates, then any disparity between men and women in society, whether it's career choices, risk-taking behavior, or physical aggression, all of it can be blamed entirely on socialization and the oppressive patriarchy.
And more importantly, it means the state can socially engineer a new, perfect, utopian human by simply changing the social inputs, right?
That's the dream of the Matrix. But Pinker gathered a mountain of cognitive science and evolutionary biology to completely dismantle that blank slate theory.
Right. Pinker demonstrated that human nature is hardwired by millions of years of evolutionary pressure. Distinct male and female natures exist independently of socialization.
And Riker uses this to prove that the male drive to provide, to build, to protect, and to engage in dangerous competition isn't some toxic pathology constructed by Victorian men to oppress women.
No, it is a biological telos. It is a built-in evolutionary purpose. The matrix demands a blank slate, but biology presents an immovable architecture.
And when individuals recognize this and refuse to speak the falsehood, Riker really elevates them. Like, look at how he frames Jordan Peterson's protest against Canada's Bill C-16 a few years ago.
Yeah, that was a huge cultural flashpoint.
Right. And Riker says Peterson wasn't just arguing about a subtle overreach in human rights legislation. In Riker's framework, Peterson recognized the epistemological murder happening in real time.
He saw the whole game.
He saw that the state was attempting to dictate the syntax of truth itself. By refusing the compelled speech, Peterson was drawing a hard line in defense of logos. He was refusing the sacrament of the neo-gnostic cult.
That makes total sense. I mean, think of the classical trivium grammar, logic, and rhetoric as the foundational operating system of Western civilization.
Okay, I like this analogy.
Right, so grammar is the anchor. It defines what things are. Logic is how those defined things interact. Rhetoric is how you persuade others based on that logic.
Yes.
Riker is essentially arguing that these activists are injecting malware directly into the grammar code. If you change the definition of a word like redefining equality, which means equal opportunity, into equity, which means forced equal outcomes regardless of competence, you corrupt the base code.
You've completely changed the terms of reality.
Exactly. And once the grammar is corrupted, the logic engine crashes. You can no longer even debate the issue because the words don't mean the same thing anymore.
That's spot on. And once logic crashes, all that is left is rhetoric. Pure, unmoored emotional manipulation and the rhetoric of victimhood. The Matrix bypasses the intellect entirely by destroying the definitions.
But wait, let me push back on this for a second because I'm sure listeners are thinking this. Language naturally evolves, right?
Sure.
Slang becomes official all the time. Meanings shift over centuries. How does Riker differentiate between the organic evolution of language and this epistemological murder he's talking about?
That's a crucial question. He distinguishes them by the mechanism of enforcement.
Enforcement.
Yeah. Organic linguistic evolution is a bottom-up process. People invent new words or shift meanings because of practical necessity, technological changes, or cultural blending, and society just voluntarily adopts them.
Right, it happens naturally.
But what Riker is identifying is a coercive, top-down mandate. The new definitions aren't arising from the street. They are being fabricated in academic departments and enforced by human resources, tribunals, and government legislatures under the threat of terminating your livelihood.
Oh, well, okay.
The presence of state or corporate coercion is the evidence that it is a hostile hijacking, not natural evolution.
That distinction makes a lot of sense within his framework. The moment you threaten a man's ability to feed his family unless he uses a newly invented pronoun, you've moved from linguistics into religious inquisitions.
Exactly.
And that leads us to the next profound layer of the book. Riker doesn't just use the word cult as a pejorative, like an insult. He systematically maps modern feminism onto the literal Latin definition of a cultus, a system of religious devotion and ritual.
He strips away what he calls the secular camouflage of the movement. For decades, feminism has presented itself as a secular political lobby focused on civil rights. But Riker argues that if you look at its functional mechanisms, it behaves identically to a fundamentalist religion.
And he identifies 4 distinct pillars that hold up this cultic architecture.
He does, and those 4 pillars completely reframe the way you view modern discourse.
Okay, let's go through them.
The first pillar is a monopolized claim on truth. There is no room for debate. The dogma of systemic patriarchal oppression is an absolute reality, and any dissenting data is treated as outright heresy.
So data doesn't matter if it contradicts the dogma.
Exactly. The second pillar is a system of ritualistic purity.
Ritualistic purity, like constantly proving you're one of the good guys.
Yes, the constant need for adherents to publicly demonstrate their ideological loyalty. Apology tours, diversity statements, checking your privilege. These are rituals of purification.
Right.
Then the third pillar is the demonization of an external oppressor. Every religion needs a devil, and in this framework, the devil is the historical patriarchy and the inherent toxicity of the masculine nature itself. All societal failures are laid at the feet of this devil.
And the fourth pillar.
The fourth is the demand for absolute ideological conformity. If you step out of line, even slightly, the punishment isn't debate. It is excommunication. It is the social and professional destruction of the heretic through cancel culture.
Wow. When you observe those 4 mechanisms operating in unison, you realize you aren't dealing with a political platform. You're dealing with a militant faith.
Exactly, a very militant faith.
And Riker takes it further into a profound theological inversion. This part blew my mind. He argues that this neo-gnostic cult has actually replaced the traditional Christian Holy Trinity with its own dark pantheon. This is one of the most striking structural analyses in the entire book.
It is incredibly detailed. Riker posits that traditional God the Father, so the archetype of the ultimate provider, the protector, the source of law, and the arbitrator of objective justice, has been systematically usurped by the omnipotent state.
The omnipotent state.
Right. The sprawling federal government, with its endless welfare programs and regulatory agencies, has stepped into the psychological void to become the new, infallible father figure.
Because the state provides the housing, the state provides the food stamps, the state provides the security, it completely crowds out the biological father.
Yes.
And then, he argues, the Holy Spirit has been replaced by infallible emotional victimhood.
This is a fascinating parallel. In classical theology, the Holy Spirit is the unseen force that animates the church and guides the believer to truth. In the feminist matrix, that unseen, unquestionable force is lived experience and emotional trauma.
Lived experience. You hear that everywhere now.
Right. It is an internal, unprovable current that animates the entire movement. If a person claims the spirit of victimhood, their emotional reality automatically supersedes objective data. To question their truth is to commit blasphemy against the spirit of the movement.
And completing this inverted trinity, replacing the sacrificed and risen son, is the masculinized career woman.
This is where Riker connects theology directly to corporate economics. Christ sacrificed himself to save humanity. In the inverted trinity, the woman sacrifices her biological telos, her natural maternal instincts, her fertility, her desire for a family upon the altar of corporate success.
That's a dark image.
By aborting her offspring or freezing her eggs to ensure she can work 80-hour weeks for a massive conglomerate, she achieves a cultic version of spiritual resurrection. She proves her ultimate loyalty to the materialist matrix, ascending to the heaven of the C-suite.
He frames this as a literal death cult, and he brings in a wild historical parallel that really makes the hair on your arms stand up. He compares modern feminism to the 12th century Cathar sect in southern France.
The Cathars are the perfect historical analog for Riker's thesis here. They were radical dualists. They believed the God of the Old Testament who created the physical world was actually Satan.
Wait, really?
Yes. Because flesh and matter were inherently corrupt, they viewed the act of procreation as the ultimate cosmic evil.
Because having a child meant trapping another pure, divine spark inside a rotting, corrupted physical body. They literally hated birth.
They were fundamentally antinatalist, and Riker links this ancient heretical dogma directly to the modern feminist view of abortion. Well, in Riker's analysis, within the neo-gnostic cult, abortion is not framed as a tragic necessity, a difficult medical procedure, or even just a matter of bodily autonomy. It is elevated to a sacrament of death and a blood ritual.
He argues that by treating pregnancy as a disease or as a patriarchal plot designed to tether women to domestic servitude, feminism mimics the Cathar rejection of the physical body.
Exactly.
They celebrate the violent termination of the unborn not as a medical reality, but as the ultimate liberation of the feminine spirit from the physical constraints of nature.
He points to the visceral reactions when Roe v. Wade was overturned, the literal wailing in the streets, the gnashing of teeth, the apocalyptic rhetoric. Riker says this is the observable behavior of religious zealots who feel their holiest sacrament has been defiled.
Right, not the behavior of voters disappointed by a Supreme Court ruling on the Commerce Clause or 14th Amendment.
Exactly, it was a religious panic.
And what happens to a religion that hates birth? Riker uses stark demographic data to show the consequences. He points to progressive religious institutions that abandoned the logos and adopted this feminist theology. The Episcopal Church is his prime example of institutional suicide.
The numbers are a brutal mathematical proof. Let's look at them. In 1965, the Episcopal Church had over 3.6 million members. It was a pillar of the American establishment.
Massive.
But over the next 50 years, they fully embraced what Riker calls feminist theology, goddess worship, and the dismantling of patriarchal authority within the church. Today, their membership has plummeted to barely 1.5 million, and their average age is over 60.
Wow. They replaced the eternal logos with the temporal, therapeutic, antinatalist matrix, and they are literally dying out because of it.
But this raises a massive logistical question.
And I was just thinking that if this ideology is fundamentally a cultic faith, a zealous religion with dogmas and sacraments, how did it manage to completely bypass the separation of church and state in the West? How does a religion become codified into our legal systems, our HR departments, and our welfare bureaucracies without the Supreme Court striking it down under the First Amendment?
Because of the secular camouflage. The genius of the Matrix is that it doesn't worship a literal deity sitting on a cloud. It worships abstract concepts. Equity, autonomy, diversity.
So it hides in plain sight.
Yes. By disguising its dogmas in the sterile language of public health policy, human resources best practices, and civil rights legislation, it slips right past the constitutional filters.
It is a religion perfectly disguised as a bureaucracy. But to understand how it achieved that level of institutional infiltration, Riker says we have to examine how this religious impulse merged with the economic strategies of Marxism.
This is the pivot where the book shifts from theology to economics. Riker argues there was a deliberate, calculated strategic pivot in the mid-20th century.
Okay, set the scene for us.
The cultural Marxists looked around and realized that traditional economic class warfare, the proletariat rising up against the bourgeoisie, was utterly failing in the West.
Because capitalism was simply too successful. It was generating too much wealth. The working class factory worker in America in 1955 had a house, a car, a television, and a pension.
Exactly. You cannot spark a violent communist revolution when the supposed oppressed class is perfectly comfortable.
So the Marxists needed a new oppressed class, and they needed a new oppressor. They executed a massive operational shift from class warfare to gender warfare.
And to prove that this isn't just a right-wing conspiracy theory, Riker goes straight to the foundational texts. He heavily cites Friedrich Engels, Karl Marx's co-author and financial patron.
What did Engels say?
In Engels' book, The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, Engels explicitly calls for the total abolition of the traditional family.
He actually says that.
Yes, Engels frames the patriarchal household not as a unit of love and mutual support, but as a purely economic exploitative construct. The husband is the bourgeois owner of the capital, and the wife is the exploited proletariat who produces the labor of raising children.
So he just mapped Marxist economics directly onto the nuclear family.
Perfectly. And Riker argues that modern feminism is simply the operational execution of Engels' 19th century communist vision. But to convince millions of women in the mid-20th century to abandon the home and turn against their husbands, the Marxists had to perform what Riker calls lexical dark magic.
Lexical dark magic.
Yeah.
They had to take the concept of male provision, like a man breaking his back for 40 years to provide a home and food for his family, and reframe it as a system of theft. They had to frame familial headship as a prison.
They systematically dismantled the cultural concept of the family wage. Historically, a man's labor was expected to generate enough surplus value to support a wife and children. Feminism inverted this.
Right.
They convinced women that being dependent on a loving husband who swore an oath to protect you was literal slavery, but being entirely dependent on a faceless corporate conglomerate that views you as an expendable human resource was ultimate freedom.
Which perfectly sets up Riker's incredibly analytical takedown of the wage gap. You hear the statistic endlessly, women make 77 cents for every dollar a man makes.
What?
Riker argues this is a total fabrication, a mathematical sleight of hand designed to hide the greatest wealth transfer in human history. He renames it the tax gap.
The mechanics of the wage gap myth are entirely exposed when you control for the variables. Riker points out that the statistic just lumps all full-time working men and all full-time working women together.
It's an aggregate number.
Exactly. But when you compare an unmarried male engineer working 80 hours a week on a deep-sea oil rig in a profession with a high mortality rate to a female sociology graduate working 35 hours a week in a climate-controlled HR department, you aren't comparing identical inputs.
Men willingly choose professions that require longer hours, immense physical hazard, and geographic isolation because those factors pay a premium. Men take the dangerous jobs because they are driven by the biological pillows to generate resources.
Right. And Riker shows the macroeconomic result of this. Men, particularly married men, are the only demographic that are net lifetime taxpayers in the system. They produce the vast majority of the surplus economic value.
And women.
Women, in the aggregate, consume more in state services, healthcare, education, welfare, than they pay in lifetime taxes.
So the state acts as the extraction mechanism. The government taxes the surplus value generated by male labor and redistributes it to women in the form of welfare checks, social services, and bloated administrative state jobs.
Yes.
The wage gap isn't evidence that corporate America is discriminating against women. It is just the accounting ledger of the state stealing from men to subsidize the matrix.
And Riker pinpoints exactly when this extraction mechanism was codified into the core of American law. He points to the 1960s, specifically Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society programs, and one program in particular, AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children.
He references the famous 1965 Moynihan Report here, right?
Yeah.
Daniel Patrick Moynihan warned the government that the nuclear family in inner-city communities was beginning to fracture, and that this would lead to generational poverty and crime.
He did warn them. But Riker argues the government didn't use that report to fix the problem. They used it as a blueprint to accelerate the destruction.
Wow. The structure of AFDC wrote a dark mathematical equation directly into federal law. The law stipulated that a mother could only receive these massive taxpayer subsidies if there was no able-bodied male present in the home.
Stop and think about the mechanics of that. The federal government literally financially penalized two-parent households. If the father stayed, the family starved. If the father abandoned his children or if the mother kicked him out, the government mailed her a check. They paid women to destroy their own families.
Riker's logic here is brutal. He demonstrates that if the state assumes the financial provisioning role of the husband, it inherently displaces the father.
Right.
The state becomes an artificial, impersonal surrogate husband. The government provides the housing, the food, and the health care. The biological father is rendered economically obsolete and physically exiled from his own home by the very system his taxes are funding.
But wait, let's explore a counterargument. Riker is making a strict, absolutist claim here, that state welfare inherently destroys fatherhood.
But what about instances where the state welfare system acts purely as an emergency safety net? Like a father is killed in a car accident, or he's paralyzed in an industrial accident, or the country hits a massive economic depression. Is there no room in Riker's philosophy for the state to provide temporary relief to a starving widow without it being labeled a neo-Marxist attempt to become a surrogate husband?
No, he definitely accounts for that. He addresses this through the principle of subsidiarity, which is crucial to his final chapters.
Yeah.
He doesn't oppose charity or emergency relief.
Okay.
He argues that relief should always flow from the closest possible source. First, the extended family steps in. If they can't, the local church or community steps in. The federal state should be an absolute, catastrophic last resort.
Makes sense.
The problem with programs like AFDC and modern welfare generally is the mechanism of their design. They were not structured as temporary bridges over a sudden hardship. They were engineered as permanent, systemic lifestyle subsidies that actively penalize the presence of a man. It is the incentive structure he is attacking.
Okay, so a temporary safety net catches you when you fall. A permanent subsidy builds a new floor that requires you to stay down.
That's a perfect way to summarize it.
And with that economic incentive established, the financial reward for the mother to remove the father, Riker, claims the state then had to build a massive, terrifying legal apparatus to enforce this extraction.
This takes us into the psychological and legal machinery of what Riker calls the legal cartel. And to explain how society allowed this cartel to be built, he introduces a concept he calls the societal shit test.
Drawing heavily on Carl Jung's depth psychology.
Yes, Jung wrote extensively about the anima and the animus. The animus is the unconscious masculine principle within the female psyche.
Right, and Jung noted that when the animus is unhealthy, when it is untethered from reason and maturity, it manifests as the negative animus. The negative animus is volatile, demanding, hypercritical, and rigidly opinionated without evidence. It is a chaotic force that constantly pushes boundaries.
Riker argues that modern feminism has weaponized this collective female shadow, this negative animus, on a civilizational scale.
The societal shit test is exactly what it sounds like in the context of interpersonal dating, but scaled up to macro politics.
Exactly. The collective negative animus began pushing the boundaries of civilization, making increasingly absurd, anti-logical demands to see if the patriarchal structures, the men in charge of the institutions, would hold the line or if they would cave into the hysteria.
And Riker's damning historical conclusion is that weak, uninitiated, comfortable men completely capitulated. Instead of acting as the patriarchal shield against chaos, instead of enforcing the boundary of the logos, men surrendered.
They just folded.
They surrendered their universities, their corporate boardrooms, and their family courts. to appease this collective emotional volatility.
And the direct result of that male capitulation was the creation of a legal cartel explicitly designed to mine men for resources. Riker breaks down the specific legal mechanisms, starting with Title 40D of the Social Security Act, passed in 1975.
On the surface, if you ask the average citizen, Title 4VD sounds like a great idea. It created federal matching funds for state child support enforcement programs. The pitch was, we are going to go after the deadbeat dads who abandon their kids.
Sounds noble, right? But Riker exposes the perverse mechanical incentive structure this law created. The federal government tied its funding directly to the amount of child support a state collected.
Oh, wow.
The more child support a state court ordered, the more federal dollars flowed into the state bureaucracy.
Follow the money.
Yeah.
This incentivized the state to maximize the number of single-mother households. To get the federal funds, the state family courts needed men to be divorced, separated from their children, and forced to pay maximum child support.
Yes.
The government turned itself into a massive, predatory debt collection agency that profits directly from the destruction of the nuclear family.
This created a multi-billion-dollar industrial complex entirely dependent on fatherlessness. The system literally cannot afford for families to stay together.
And the legal mechanisms get even darker when you look at domestic violence interventions. Riker brings up the Duluth model, created in the 1980s.
The Duluth model is the dominant framework used by almost all law enforcement and family courts across the Western world when responding to domestic disputes, and Riker absolutely eviscerates it.
Because it wasn't designed by clinical psychologists analyzing empirical data, right?
No, it was designed by a group of radical feminist activists. Let's walk through the mechanics of the Duluth model flowchart. It operates entirely on Marxist feminist dogma. It assumes, a priori, that all domestic violence is rooted in male patriarchal control.
So it completely denies the existence of female agency or female-initiated violence.
Completely. If a couple gets into an altercation and the police are called, the Duluth model trains those officers to view the man as the perpetual oppressor based solely on his biological sex.
Even if she started it.
Even if the woman is the clear aggressor, even if the man has defensive wounds, the framework dictates that he must be using his male privilege to manipulate the situation, and therefore he should be arrested to break the cycle of patriarchal power.
Riker points out that this is completely divorced from empirical sociological reality, which shows that domestic violence is frequently reciprocal or female-initiated.
Yes.
Yet this ideological fantasy is enforced with the full coercive power of the criminal justice system. A man can lose his home, his children, and his freedom based on a feminist flowchart that denies his humanity.
It is the institutionalization of misandry, and we see this complete suspension of constitutional due process expanding everywhere. Riker touches upon the Title IX ex-kangaroo courts in universities.
Yeah, he cites a glaring, terrifying example from 2016 at the University of Cincinnati.
The university set up a tribunal to judge a male student accused of misconduct. The tribunal was so manifestly unjust, so heavily biased by the Matrix's demand to believe all accusers without evidence, that a federal appellate judge had to forcefully intervene.
That's crazy.
The federal court had to step in and remind the university that the United States Constitution still exists and that a young man has a basic right to cross-examine his accuser.
The university administration was perfectly willing to sacrifice a young man's entire future, to brand him a monster upon the altar of the collective feminine shadow. It took the might of a federal appellate court to rip him out of the jaws of the bureaucratic beast.
And Riker expands this analysis of institutional failure to the corporate world, pointing to the inversion of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Right, a law that was explicitly written to prohibit discrimination based on race or sex has been inverted by the DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion bureaucracy into a system that strictly enforces racial and sexual quotas.
Riker uses the Boeing 737 MAX disaster as the ultimate empirical proof of what happens when the Matrix conquers the logos.
How does he connect that?
Well, engineering is the purest manifestation of the logos. Gravity doesn't care about your diversity statement, but when a corporation prioritizes DEI quotas over rigorous, objective, unyielding engineering competence, the physical reality reasserts itself.
The planes literally fall out of the sky.
Exactly.
Think of it like a virus hijacking a host. Riker explicitly notes that feminism doesn't build anything of its own. It has never built a hospital, it has never written a constitution, it has never engineered a bridge.
It's purely parasitic in his view.
It simply acts as a virus that infects the existing infrastructure. The courts, the universities, the aerospace corporations. It rewrites the code of those institutions to replicate its own ideology while disguising itself as a moral upgrade.
The virus co-opts the host's machinery until the host dies. And that brings us to the most terrifying mathematical realization in the book. Once the institutions are captured and the nuclear family is systematically dismantled to feed the welfare state, Riker claims society enters a terminal phase.
This is where Riker lays out the cold, hard math of demographic extinction. He dispenses with all the political rhetoric, the culture war talking points, and presents a strict, unassailable categorical syllogism regarding the survival of the welfare state.
Let's examine the mechanics of that syllogism. The major premise is a basic macroeconomic reality. A pay-as-you-go welfare state, which includes massive systems like Social Security and Medicare, requires a continuously expanding base of young, highly productive taxpayers to fund the entitlements of the aging population.
It is, by definition, a Ponzi scheme.
Exactly. For the math to work, every generation must be larger than the last.
And the minor premise is that the neo-gnostic cult of feminism deliberately suppresses the birth rate massively below replacement levels.
Yes.
By weaponizing abortion as a sacrament, by legally penalizing men who want to marry and build families, and by convincing women that corporate careerism is spiritually superior to motherhood, the system guarantees that fewer and fewer children are born.
Which leads to the inescapable conclusion. Therefore, the feminist welfare state is biologically and mathematically unsustainable.
It's an Ouroboros.
Yes, it literally consumes its own future, the unborn children, to sustain the narcissism and the financial entitlements of the present generation.
Riker argues that the so-called liberation of women into the corporate workforce in the 1970s was actually the greatest, most successful labor coup by the corporate elite in human history.
This is a huge point. By convincing women to leave the home and enter the labor market en masse, they doubled the labor pool overnight.
And basic supply and demand dictates that when you double the supply of labor, you have the value of wages.
Exactly.
The corporate machine transformed women from the sovereign builders of multi-generational family dynasties into double-taxed, atomized, easily controllable corporate units who will gladly work for a fraction of the historical family wage.
The system tricked women into trading the sacred, vital vocation of motherhood for spreadsheets and middle management titles. And Riker uses harrowing demographic statistics to show exactly where this mathematically ends. Look at South Korea.
Oh, the numbers there are just grim.
In 2023, South Korea's fertility rate plummeted to a catastrophic 0.72. Demographers agree you need a replacement rate of 2.1 just to maintain a stable population.
So South Korea isn't just shrinking, it is mathematically evaporating.
And Riker looks at Japan to show the psychological horror of this evaporation. He points to the phenomenon of kodokushi,
Kodokushi, what is that?
the lonely death. This is perhaps the most chilling part of his analysis. Riker describes how in hyper-aged, anti-natalist societies like Japan, entire specialized industries have sprung up to deal with the aftermath of the Matrix.
What do these industries do?
These are companies whose sole purpose is to clean the apartments of elderly people who die completely alone.
They die entirely devoid of family. They have no children, no grandchildren, no husband or wife.
No.
They are surrounded only by the memory of their careers and the checks from the state welfare system. Their bodies lie rotting for weeks or months before a neighbor notices the smell.
It's horrific.
Riker says this is the visceral, horrifying endpoint of the feminist utopia. You get a state-subsidized existence that ends in an unmourned oblivion. The state will extract taxes to pay your pension, but the state cannot hold your hand as you die.
It is a profound, tragic image of a civilization that has completely forgotten its biological and spiritual purpose.
But how did we get here psychologically? How did millions of women become convinced that having children was somehow a bad or irresponsible idea?
Riker points to the intellectual justification provided by the radical environmental movement. Specifically, he targets Paul Ehrlich's 1968 book, The Population Bomb.
I remember hearing about that book. Ehrlich predicted massive global starvation and societal collapse in the 1970s and 80s due to rampant overpopulation.
Yeah, he claimed the Earth couldn't sustain human growth. Every single apocalyptic prediction in that book was spectacularly, embarrassingly wrong. The Green Revolution in agriculture allowed us to feed billions more.
But Riker argues the book was never about accurate science. It served a vital ideological purpose.
Yeah.
It gave women a pseudo-scientific moral cover to abandon motherhood.
Yes.
It reframed childlessness. Instead of being viewed as selfish or biologically tragic, refusing to have children was elevated to a heroic act to save the planet.
So you have collapsing birth rate and a sprawling welfare state that desperately needs young taxpayers to survive. How does the government try to solve this mathematically impossible problem?
Immigration.
Riker points to the United Nations year 2000 report on replacement migration.
When the state realizes that Native men are utterly disincentivized from building families because the family courts will destroy them, and Native women refuse to have children because their careers demand total allegiance, the state realizes it is running out of tax mules.
The Ponzi scheme is about to collapse.
So their desperate band-aid is mass immigration.
Import millions of foreign laborers from entirely different cultural paradigms to prop up the failing welfare state. Riker argues this is not a policy of compassion or diversity. It is an ecologically disastrous, mathematically destitute attempt to delay the inevitable economic implosion.
And in doing so, they actively dissolve the cultural and historical cohesion of the host nation. Riker draws a stark historical parallel here to the fall of the Roman Empire.
Ah, yes.
When native Roman citizens became decadent, stopped having children, and refused to fight in the legions, Rome had to rely on foreign mercenaries, the foederati, to defend the borders and do the labor. We all know how that ended in 476 AD.
The mercenaries simply took over the hollowed-out empire.
But what about technology? What about the argument that AI and advanced robotics will automate the economy, generate infinite wealth, and save the welfare state without needing young taxpayers?
Riker dismantles that techno-utopian cope instantly. He points out a fundamental economic reality. Robots don't buy houses.
Algorithms don't pay income taxes.
Exactly. AI doesn't consume consumer goods at scale. You cannot run a debt-based consumer economy without human beings forming households and buying things.
So he is painting a picture of total, inescapable systemic collapse. The math simply doesn't work. This brings up the pivotal question for the reader. If the system is mathematically doomed, what is his prescription for the men reading this? Does he just want them to give up?
Is it a black pill book?
Yeah, this is a 200-page book, just a highly articulated suicide note for Western civilization.
That brings us to the final and most actionable phase of Riker's argument, because the answer is an emphatic no.
Okay, good.
The diagnosis is terminal for the current system, but Riker vehemently rejects what the internet calls the black pill, the nihilistic urge to just give up, drop out of society, play video games, and wait for the collapse.
He considers the black pill to be a profound spiritual failure. He reaches back into theological history again, likening the black pill to a concept developed by 4th century desert monks called acedia.
Acedia. It translates roughly to spiritual sloth.
But it's not physical laziness, right? A monk suffering from acedia might still be physically working, sweeping the floor, going through the motions.
Right. Acedia is a paralysis of the will. It is a creeping, cynical indifference that replaces a man's vital drive with a hollow shrug. Riker famously calls the black pill acedia with a Wi-Fi connection.
I love that line. He argues that the uninitiated male who simply withdraws into his basement and complains on internet forums is failing his biological design just as much as the weak man who actively capitulates to feminist demands. Both have abandoned the logos.
So if you don't surrender to despair, and you don't waste your energy trying to save the current captured system, what is the strategy? Riker calls for a strategic withdrawal of labor and the active building of parallel patriarchal microcultures.
This is where he introduces the Catholic social doctrine of subsidiarity. He draws this from Pope Pius XII's 1931 encyclical. Let's really dig into the mechanics of subsidiarity because it's the core of his survival manual.
Okay, so the doctrine of subsidiarity dictates that political and social issues should be handled by the smallest, most local, most competent authority possible.
So starting from the bottom up.
Right. The foundational unit of authority is the family. The family governs itself. The local community exists only to assist the family. The state exists only to serve the community.
Subsidiarity puts the family firmly, structurally, above the state. The state is supposed to be a limited tool to protect the family from external threats. It is not supposed to be a leviathan that cannibalizes the family by seizing the children, dictating their moral curriculum, or redistributing the father's wealth.
Riker is telling men to use subsidiarity as a shield. Stop feeding your energy, your outrage, and your capital into the macro state. Withdraw your consent and start building the micro-family.
And he provides very specific, highly tactical advice for the red-pilled man on how to execute this withdrawal.
It reads like a manual for legal and financial survival in hostile territory. He advises men to legally minimize their tax footprints as aggressively as possible. If the state uses your taxes to fund the matrix, you must starve the beast of its capital.
He advocates for the use of complex asset protection trusts to shield generational wealth from the predatory reach of family courts. He explicitly tells men to refuse to cohabit in common law jurisdictions where the state can unilaterally declare you married after a few years and seize your assets without you ever signing a contract.
He is telling men to become financially invisible to the extractors, but more importantly, he's telling them to build. And he doesn't just offer this as a theoretical hope.
He points to hard demographic data as proof of concept that parallel patriarchal societies will inevitably win the long game.
Yes, he looks at the Amish and the Orthodox Jews.
Look at the demographics. The Amish population in North America doubles approximately every 20 years. They have explosive exponential growth. Orthodox Jewish communities and highly traditionalist Catholic enclaves are experiencing the exact same phenomenon.
Why are they thriving and expanding while the secular progressive West is mathematically dying? Because they maintain rigorous, unapologetic, patriarchal family structures.
They fiercely reject the antinatalist matrix. They completely separate themselves from the captured mainstream institutions. They run their own schools, they settle disputes internally, and they prioritize the creation of life.
Riker delivers a line here that perfectly encapsulates the entire book. He writes, "You do not win a demographic war with a podcast, you win it with a cradle."
It's brilliant.
Yeah.
These traditional communities aren't wasting their time debating gender theory on social media. They aren't trying to convince the matrix to change its mind. They're simply outbreeding the madness. They're transmitting the logos through sheer, undeniable biological presence.
Reading this final chapter, it becomes clear that Riker is framing his solution not as a political campaign to save the current system, but as the building of an ark.
He's telling his readers to look around. The Western Empire is Rome in 476 AD. The barbarians aren't just at the gates. They are running the HR departments and the family courts. The empire is already over.
And instead of desperately trying to patch the holes in a sinking ship, men need to gather the blueprints of the logos. They need to build an ark of extreme competence, of legally protected strong families, of tight-knit local communities, and simply let the tide of irrationality drown itself.
The sandcastle of the corporate feminist, which relies entirely on the extraction of male labor and the artificial support of the state, will inevitably wash away in the demographic tide. But the cathedral of the patriarchal family, built on the bedrock of natural law, will stand.
He is calling for a new renaissance, forged by men who have mastered themselves, submitted to natural law, and are ready to act as the vanguard of a new civilization after the collapse.
So let's look back at everything we've just journeyed through. For the target audience of red-pilled men and men's rights activists, cryptofeminism offers something incredibly potent, a rigorous, classical, philosophical vocabulary.
Absolutely.
Riker takes the raw, visceral anger that so many men feel towards modern institutions, the bias of family courts, the absurdity of DEI mandates, the extraction of the welfare system, and he gives them a highly structured framework to articulate exactly why they feel that way.
He validates their experience by mapping out the precise historical mechanisms of the transition. He shows exactly how we move from the objective logos to the subjective matrix, from Marxist class warfare to feminist gender warfare, and from the nuclear family to the surrogate state.
It is a comprehensive intellectual armory. And as we close out this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought, building directly on the mechanics of Riker's source material.
Let's hear it.
We spent a lot of time discussing how the state engineered itself to act as a surrogate husband and father through the welfare system and institutionalized education. But think about the psychological endpoint of this process.
The end game.
If the modern welfare state was designed to displace the biological father, what happens to the psychological stability of a civilization when an entire generation, raised exclusively by the cold, impersonal bureaucracy of the state, eventually inherits the levers of power?
A bureaucracy can issue a food stamp, and it can enforce a diversity quota, but it cannot provide paternal love. It cannot model masculine restraint. What kind of leaders emerge from a system devoid of that deeply personal biological connection?
Can a machine transmit the logos? When the children of the bureaucracy become the architects of our future, what kind of world will they build? It's a terrifying question to ponder, and it is the ultimate test of everything Riker has warned about.
The future will belong to whichever group has the discipline to answer that question with a family rather than a policy.
And that brings us to the end of our analysis. I need to remind you directly. If this exploration of the history of captured institutions, the Gnostic matrix, and the defense of the Logos resonates with you, you absolutely need to read this book for yourself.
Seriously, check it out.
Go to Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks right now to purchase Cryptofeminism by Conrad Riker. You need to dive into the primary text to see the data for yourself.
The sheer depth of his historical citations and the economic data he provides really requires a direct, careful reading.
And make sure to follow him on Substack at Conrad Riker for more deep analysis and ongoing commentary. His Substack is where this intellectual battle is being fought in real time. Finally, please like this video and subscribe to the channel right now to support more deep dives like this one.
We appreciate you taking this immense journey into the architecture of reality with us.
Until next time.
Keep building the arc.